Today we're going to be talking about the data that you're using to make database decisions in the assessment of consultation. There's certain basics, so a lot of this comes straight out of your text. Um, so just some overview about consultation and then the role that assessment plays in it will be discussed as we go along. It's the kind of things that happen in schools that we may consult on: primary prevention, risk reduction, early intervention, and treatment. So a lot of times people kind of just jump straight to treatment because that's a lot of times where we are brought in. But remembering that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so if we can be proactive in our consultation for the prevention and risk reduction sides, we won't have quite so much treatment work we have to be involved in. There are certain terms that get thrown around with consultation in schools. They are used a lot of times interchangeably. They're not exactly the same, but both of them fall under something called multi-tiered systems of support. Both of them have the same three-tiered pyramid, sometimes a fourth tier. And then both of them, have very similar structures. The only big difference is that RTI tends to be for academic things, reading, writing, math, whereas PBS or PBIS is used for social, behavioral, and sometimes emotional issues. So they're both, everything else is pretty much the same except the target, and they've both been collapsed under the same umbrella term of MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. So what are these objectives at these different tiers? So we're going to talk about tier 1 and 2 here. These are the baseline tiers at first. As a consultant, the first thing is to establish trust. They're not going to listen to you if they don't believe in you. And we've already talked a little bit about referent and expert levels of trust. Do they trust you, and why do they trust you? You need to, as part of this, remember that this is not a hierarchical thing. You're not their boss. Collaboration and consultation go hand in hand. Instead, you are a set of equals meeting one another. And as such, it is your job and part to find out what this teacher is an expert as, and then what the parent is an expert as, or whatever, so that you can figure out their strengths and where they're coming from, instead of just focusing on negative aspects. This tends to be done through interviews and observations. You also want to be a part of the team that figures out what are our goals, not just for this child at tier 2 or tier 3, but in general. So kind of going back to some of those prevention methods. Part of what we do are facilitate and interpret the assessments. We don't always give all the assessments, but we need to be able to help individuals understand the data that they're getting, and then identify empirically supported instructional and intervention strategies. So it's our job often to be the one to come in and examine what people are doing and decide whether or not it is research-based, and if it's not research-based, then to help them identify ones that are empirically based to use instead. So just remembering that within consultation, there's a singular belief that the child's issues are the system's issues. It's not that the child's issues are a diagnostic concern. So even if the child, let's say, has a diagnosis of ADHD, the diagnosis itself is not the child's problem. It's the way that the school and the parent and the classroom interact with that child, and then all of a sudden it becomes the child's issue as well. So with consultation, you're not trying to fix the child. Your goal is to try and fix the system in which the child lives. Consultation, as I remind you before, is not a direct thing. You don't work directly with the child. You work with those who work with the child. So remembering it's not hierarchical. You're not the boss. You always have to remember, what are your expectations that you hold now and what you're going to hold later? And then what are things you're really good at? And then what are things that those individuals are good at, and meet them as experts. Even if you were working with a parent who is illiterate. They're not going to be literacy experts, but they're going to be an expert on that child. Teachers are going to be experts on that child's learning. They may not know everything there is to know about every aspect of learning and teaching, but they're going to know about that child's learning a lot better than you are. And the parents are going to know more about that child's emotions and motivations and feelings than you are. Principals are going to know more about the infrastructure of that school than you are. So, what do you bring to the table? Well, the things that I'm teaching you and the things you've been taught in your other classes. So, what are the goals of consultation? Well, you want to make sure that as a consultant, you use evidence-based instruction or an evidence-based techniques that are based on where the child is. You meet the child where they are. Don't try and shoot too high for your goals or your interventions or too low. Either way, you'll kill motivation. You want to make sure that they're developmentally appropriate and then that they meet the needs of the child and then also that they are assessed correctly. How do you know if something has gotten better if you haven't evaluated it correctly? So how do you get people to change? Well, we already talked a little bit about that when we talked about the discussions of power. So this idea of expert or referent power, that's fine. Collaboration often works as a reference sort of method. If you provide them with evidence-based practices, that's more of an expert method. Modeling behaviors for them could be either expert or referent, but providing data in general, I mean, that could go into a reward or a punishment sort of situation, but that's not the goal. The goal is just by having the data, they can see, oh, this is working, I should keep doing it. Or this isn't working, I really should change. These are all ways that we can get people to stop what they're doing if it's incorrect and change, remembering that the goal of consultation is not to change the child, that's the outcome. The goal of consultation is to change the system. Okay. So what are the basic steps? The first is formal introduction. You have to be introduced in some way for them to believe in you. You have to develop a partnership where they do feel that they are equals with you. Again, not equal in what you know, but equal as an experts meeting together. You have to identify and analyze exactly what the problem is, develop the intervention, and then implement, evaluate, and follow up on the intervention. So you'll notice that in 5 out of the 5 steps, 2 of them include evaluation and analysis, which is assessment. So that is why your second lecture, this lecture is so important, is so early, because assessment is part of consultation. So data, data, data. We have, if you use a rational persuasion, you get intervention information straight off of the data. And that tells the person why it's important to use the intervention. This intervention's been proven. Here's the data for that intervention. It also helps identify what some objections they might have to the intervention. Oh, this intervention was proven, but only with boys, and you have a class of girls, or was only with 5th graders, but you have a class of 3rd graders. Okay, so this is why you need to not just identify, oh, this is a thing you can try, but actually identifying if it's going to work for that individual. So some of the assessment data we're going to be looking at, and we're going to talk more about later, is what you need in order to find an effective intervention. But how can you be effective? Well, actually provide research citations. Oftentimes having, instead of you just saying, this is something I think you should do, that's a boss talking. Instead of, you can say something like, research has supported this in the past, and so therefore you're both learners together. Discuss consequences. So if it doesn't get better, what are you going to do next? And then provide baseline and response data. So all of these things are necessary in any kind of change. So just a little aside, so you know, there are going to be conflicting opinions when you go into a consultation situation. School psychologists, most of them want to spend more time doing consultation, but they're really spending a lot more of their time doing assessment. And we're assessing children we think the problem is in the child. We do consultation when we think the problem is within the system. And we're going to talk today about how we differentiate which of those we should be doing. So ideally, we should be trying to figure out the system so that children do not get referred who really don't have a disability. Whereas teachers, it's really when you're saying, oh, Bobby can't learn, and it's your fault, teacher, nobody responsible to that. Instead, it's Bobby can't learn, and let's look and see how we can identify what is causing Bobby to have problems with learning. So the teachers often don't want to hear that. They really want to say, Bobby must have a disability because I tried everything and it ain't working. And they want to get direct services. We want to put Bobby in special ed and get him out of my classroom and have him become somebody else's issue. And so a lot of times you will have teachers that are reluctant to the consultation process because they don't think that the system the child is in is the problem. Or if they do think the system is a problem, it's something's happening at home. So Bobby must not be doing well because mama doesn't do whatever they think mama should do. So again, and we could do consultation with mama too. Part of the consultation process is meeting with a second person who is involved school-based level with the child. But the easiest one for us to do and help is going to be the one who's right in front of us. So we will be talking about how the person who is the client and the issue and where the client issue is, how we match the interventions to that. But today is assessment. So what are some basic barriers? And part of what we're assessing is these barriers. So why can't we get consultation to work in these situations? A lot of times school psychs have too high of a test load. A lot of times schools don't really want to change. Sometimes there's an organizational climate where, you go to work with a teacher and, and you get in trouble because you should be doing more testing or whatever. So you may have to make sure you navigate the organization. Some classrooms just are not conducive to ever being able to meet with a teacher. How do you find a time to meet and do the entire consultation process? Sometimes your office is not in the building, and the only times you're in the building is when you have gone there. And you get there, you do your work, and you leave. And there's not a singular place where a teacher can come to you and ask for help. That makes things more complicated. So you have to look at these barriers and come up with solutions on how to make them work. So there's also barriers on the consultant's side. So those are barriers on your system that you're in, but you have your own barriers. You may not feel confident in providing assistance in a particular area. It's this child has a problem with math. Well, I wasn't good at math, if that's your belief. And then you're like, now I have to teach math. Well, you don't have to teach math, but you do have to learn enough about how math is taught. So sometimes if you don't have expertise, you have to develop it. You may not be motivated. Some folks, some consultants say, you know what, I would rather just do counseling and testing. I'm not interested in consultation. You may not have the interpersonal skills to get people to do what you want them to do. You may not be seen in the school as a member of the school, therefore not providing you with the kind of power that you need in order to make change happen. You may not know basic classroom management skills. You may be worried about addressing issues head on with teachers who are lacking skills or they have their own mental health issues, about you looking bad. And then you may actually have the expertise, but not the self-confidence. You may have all of those things, but you're not very good at communicating what you want. And in general, you may either feel like you're not able to control a situation or you're trying to put too much control over a situation. These are all things that are intra to you. These are things that you can work on if you identify them as a barrier. The other things are issues that are intra to the system, and they can also be worked on, but they do take a different approach. So let's talk about different tiered assessments throughout each of the MTSS processes. So screening through diagnostics. Assessment through RTI, Tier 1 tends to be some sort of screener. Tier 2 tends to be a way to identify the exact kind of problem that the child has. You don't set up an intervention without knowing what's wrong. And then You have a progress monitoring tool that tells you if the child has met their goals in the intervention. And then tier 3 oftentimes plays into getting a child either more general ed services, but oftentimes tier 3 is special ed. And so the assessments between tier 2 and tier 3 are the typical ones we would use in transitioning a person into special education. So we're going to talk about these as we go through. So tier 1, certain assessments, some things are not just going to be rating scales and um, and giving an IQ test. A lot of these assessments are more broad, more qualitative. Some things are just looking around, and talking to people, doing observations, doing interviews, looking at records, finding out what the history of the situation is, talking to other people who've tried making change in that system, talking, because that's a big one. What have you tried and why did it fail? For you guys that are really counseling folks, this is a very solution focused time where you're trying to figure out exactly where they've been successful and where they haven't, so that you can figure out where the system has gaps and how you would move them forward. You would also want to look at any kind of general learning environment. You can look at this particular classroom. It's a mess. Just looking at it, I would think, how in the world can the teacher or the children or anyone get anything done in this situation? So, this is the sort of, sometimes it's an observation, sometimes it's evaluating the curriculum that's being used, seeing how is the teacher choosing to group kids together, how does the teacher talk to the kids, how does the teacher talk to the parents, all these sort of things. These are things you can only see by actually being in the space. So one other tier 1 thing that's really important has to do with student engagement, which is getting a kid involved. Sometimes kids won't do, and sometimes kids can't do. And that's a really big important thing for us to differentiate is won't do versus can't do. And then can't do is broken into can't do because they haven't got the foundation they need, which is a general education issue, or can't do because they have a disability and they need accommodations in order to support their learning in that area. But in the tier 1 area, we are assuming can't do because they need supports and they need just foundational information, or won't do because they're unmotivated. So these are some areas we look at. Behavioral stuff, we're looking at engagement. Do they show up? Are they involved in other classes? Like, do they come and then they're really excited about being in science, but they just don't like PE? Are they the kind of kids who show up late, leave early? Those sort of, what are their behaviors that show if it's a can't do or a won't do? Academics, are they working and working and working and not getting anywhere? Or are they just spending 2 seconds and then walking off and then why aren't they doing well? Because they weren't actually doing the work. Cognitively, you have expectations about is this a child who expects to have someone to hold their hand the whole time? Or is this a child who is like, no, I'm going to do it? Are they going to take responsibility? Or are they going to wait till the very last minute to do it or not do it at all? And then if you teach them a learning strategy, using flashcards or something like that, will they implement those strategies or are they just not going to? And so with this one, it could be that they're not motivated or that they don't know these strategies, or it could be an executive functioning disorder of some sort. So remembering, the assumption within consultation, though, is that it's a systems issue, not a child issue. And then psychologically, do they feel like they're part of the group? Do they feel like that they have anybody, teachers, parents, other kids, the lunch lady, the librarian, anybody who makes them feel included and confident? So other evaluations are just things like, does the room smell? Is it well lit? Can the kids hear in the back of the room? Maybe sometimes sit in the back of the room. Is it uncomfortable? Does it look awful? Is everything broken? Um, how is the teacher teaching? Is she just putting the kids in rows and talking at them? Or are they actually getting a chance to do activities? Those sorts of things. All right, so those are basic tier 1 assessments. Now, the bridge between tier 1 and tier 2 is going to be screeners, like we talked about. Teacher reports or screeners to say this child is not, there's nothing that we can do at the tier 1 to make it better. We've tried fixing the system at that level. So, but these kids need extra help. So let's talk about those assessments. So one of the big things that's really important is that you are not comparing apples to oranges. Remembering that what you do, I don't know why it's showing all these like flying in things. Um, what you're doing is looking at making sure that what you use to screen the child is having a problem and what you use to evaluate the child for having, to getting better, the progress monitoring tool. Whatever it is you use, that should match the curriculum. So I love to tell the story early in the days of RTI where I was in a meeting and the teacher said to me, she said, well, I gave the child the dibbles and the child never got any better. It didn't matter what I did, the child didn't improve. And I was like, but you put a math intervention in place. She's like, yeah. And I said, the dibbles is a reading test. She said, yeah. I said, well, of course the child didn't improve in reading, when they had a math intervention. She's like, well, that's the instrument that school told us to use. No, you test progress monitoring on an assessment tool that is similar to the thing that you're actually teaching. All right, so, and one of the things about the assessment tool is it has to be able to measure small changes. You can't have a single item, but it also can't be too long that it becomes burdensome, so you can't have 200 items. It needs to be just enough that you can see that the child is improving or getting worse, but that it's not too difficult to get done. A lot of times normative-based tests are not great for this because normative-based tests have very small numbers of items in specific areas to see, are you weird? What you're really wanting are assessments that say, have you met a standard? And those assessments tend to be curriculum-based measures. So it's like, this is what a second grader should know on this topic, and here's 12 items, right? Or observations, structured observations. Hopefully you guys have had a behavioral assessment class of some sort, behavior management class, where you've talked about structured observation systems. And again, you wouldn't observe them for 1 second. You would probably want to do an observation of at least 10 minutes in order to get enough data for you to have reliable data that's not too onerous to keep doing assessments of that data or that behavior. All right. And then formative, whatever you're giving should evaluate. Don't wait until the end of 12 weeks before you're like, did it work? That's the question we ask at the end. But during it, if you're seeing no improvement at 2 or 3 weeks, maybe it's time for you to rethink what you're doing. Okay. So assessment methods, the more direct, the better. So, having a teacher do a rating scale of a child's behavior is probably not as good as just observing the child's behavior, unless it's a behavior that occurs very infrequently. Okay. So make it as direct as you can. Indirect, you want to make sure if you do an indirect assessment, and so direct is something you give directly to the child or with the child, including observations. If you're doing a direct assessment, it would be better. An indirect assessment is going to be asking someone else to tell you what their opinion is on something. Just be really cautious. Make sure that there's enough items on that if it's a rating scale of some sort. So some of the rating scales that we are using now for indirect assessments of behavior, for instance, are the Basque Flex Monitor and the Achenbach ACEBA group. They have their own. And we're going to talk more about those kind of assessments. But oftentimes, academic behavior is measured by curriculum-based measurement, which is a direct assessment, and social, emotional, or behavioral issues, particularly externalizing behaviors, are almost always measured by observations directly with the child, and internalizing things like anxiety or depression, those tend to be measured by rating scales. They can be done directly with the child, the rating scale, or the adult. And all these things that we're talking about can be applied at any level. A child, adult, preschool, this is the general concept. Okay? So those are the three different types of ways that we tend to collect response to intervention data, is hopefully directly and something that will match. All right, so here you go. This is your very first assignment I want for you guys to do on the worksheet. You should have been taking notes as you go along, but this extra worksheet is just separate. This is going to look like this, so that you're going to go through each one of these and decide. So your first one is, which of the tools across the top here would you use to decide if you're moving a child from tier 1 to tier 2? And you can put X's in any of these that you think would be appropriate. Then if you're trying to diagnose an achievement problem or diagnose a social emotional behavioral problem, which ones do you use for that? For tracking at a tier 2 level or a tier 3 level, again, what might you use for that? And then deciding to place a child into special ed, what would you use? So this would be an opportunity for you to pause, and I do want you to try this. Now, I am going to about to show you what the results are, but I want on your own for you to try it. And then if there's a difference in what your responses are versus what I'm about to show you, then just mark them in a different color or with circles instead of X's or whatever, so that I can see that you attempted it yourself. All right. All right, welcome back. So here is what it would look like, right? Deciding to go from tier 1 to tier 2, we already talked about this. Screeners and teacher referrals, that's the way to go, right? And maybe you have some sort of broad normative-based achievement test that was done, like the FCAT or the FSA or whatever. And then the CBM or curriculum-based benchmark measure maybe was done by the school at some point to say these are issues, right? And as you go through, notice here at the bottom, ideally for moving a child into special education, you would see that they move through each of the tiers. And so as they went through the tiers, they would have gotten every single thing. And these should make sense as you keep going through the kinds of things that you give. If you look at this, you're like, I don't completely understand it, then put it aside and go back to it at the end of today's lecture. So let's talk about identifying and analyzing problems. Problem identification goes into these multiple stages. So we're going to talk first about the definition of a problem. We have to operationally define it. We need to have positive, measurement-based, clear, so that if two different people are looking at it, they'll say, yep, that's the same problem. And at the end, you should be able to develop some sort of assessment or identify an assessment that's going to help you collect data. If it's not measurable, it's not operationally defined. Again, I'm hoping that you guys went through operationally defining behaviors in a previous behavior management class. But we're going to practice that quickly here. We have a video of Manuel. He is a male child with dark hair in this video here. You're going to watch the video and you're going to see if you can come up with a behavior that is measurable, clear, and would allow you to collect baseline. So on this side over here, we have an example. Bobby is out of his chair and bothering other kids. That is what the teacher said. But when I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to observe in a classroom setting, so we're going to be doing a structured observation of some sort because this is an externalizing behavior. Manuel's is also an externalizing behavior. I have to break it down into information that's positive and measurable. I can turn both of these into something I can sit and every 2 seconds mark off if he's doing this or not, right? So this is not just that he's out of his chair is not particularly positive. It's much more about what he's not doing right than what he is doing right. So it's, so you can either measure either direction. Ideally, positive is nice in the beginning as you go through. So, and then what is in your chair? So sometimes kids will hover, or they're near their chair, or they got one knee in a chair. Like this tells you the child has his bottom in the chair or his legs in the chair, and legs plural, so one leg is not going to get it. And this is, you measure it by the number of times of him not meeting this goal, that's the goal, or the assessment could be the number of times that he is meeting this goal. It's up to you, just be consistent all the way through. And then the second part is he's bothering other children. Well, we've identified bothering other children as appropriate attention from others. And this got further broken down to the student talks when appropriate and does not purposefully draw attention to himself in a negative manner. This can be measured by intensity and number of times. So again, you can watch each time he does this positive thing, you put a check mark in that period of time or however it is that you're going to do an assessment with observation data. The other option is that you break out each of those things and watch him and say, oh, he's doing this. 1 is never and 5 is always. And then you just mark a rating yourself on your observation. With that, though, you're going to want more than just one thing. You're going to want to break each of those things. So student talks when appropriate, 1 to 5. Does not purposely draw attention to himself, 1 to 5. Negative man, attention he's drawing to himself is a negative. So now you have 3 items that you've built as a rating, 1 to 5 of the intensity. So you can use any one of those 3 behaviors. If you did it and someone else did it, they can look at that and understand it and then move from there. So with Manuel, you're going to be doing the same thing. Here's the video for Manuel. And so one of the things I want for you to do, you're going to be doing this in your worksheet and getting a chance to kind of make sure whatever it is that you're choosing is something that you can observe. And if you were to trade it with someone else, they could observe it too and monitor exactly how often or how long something is occurring. So the next thing that you would do is figure out what's happening before and after the identified problem behavior. And antecedents tend to be the ones that are before, and consequences are what happens after. So antecedents can be things like the teacher looks away. It could be that the bell rings or you're in a transition. Antecedent can even be child 1 made him mad at lunch and now it's after lunch and he has not been able to control his emotions. So antecedents can be immediate. They can also be ones that happened that morning. He was running late from school and he's been in a bad mood all day. It can be situational. You moved him to Mrs. Jones's class and he doesn't like Miss Jones. And so, whatever the antecedents are, you want to make sure that every time you collect the data, you write down exactly what's going on situationally or what's going on with that child. So you have the qualitative data of the antecedent, what you see, what you know about what's happening before the behavior happens. And then you have the operationally defined behavior. And then on the other end is the consequence. What happens to him? And again, this is qualitative. What happens to him? Does he get in trouble? Does the other kids laugh? Is he able to is he able to avoid doing the work he didn't want to do? Consequences. Well, and so when you're going to put an intervention together, having this antecedent and consequences data to go along with behavior really allows you to say, do I need to target stuff that's going on with him before he does the behavior or ways that we're reinforcing the behavior and we don't mean to? All right, so you're going to do that with Manuel. You're going to go ahead and identify any antecedents or consequences and put that into your worksheet. All right, so now we're going to keep going. One of the other things we would talk about are any relevant variables within the environment. We talked earlier about doing some of this tier 1 observations. And so I want you to take a look at the video again and then see, are there things in there that are relevant variables within the environment that would be problematic. Also, we talked about some resources that are available to the client and consultee. What are you seeing that's in the room that could be helpful to you or to the client or to the teacher even to be able to help make this work? Is there enough room for the child to be moved somewhere else? Is there a way to reorganize the materials? What is it that's there that you could use? And again, this is on your worksheet. And then finally, well, that was the identifying the available resources. So just some ideas too about some resources you can be looking at for that last part are these same ones we talked about. Are there issues, system barriers, or consultant barriers for Manuel that should be discussed that may apply to you as the consultant or may apply within the system itself? Okay. So just as an aside, this should probably be in another set of slides, but this is just for you to go back in your book. This is a great list. Sometimes a lot of the issues have to do with the consultant, um, that that you're trying to do things. You're trying to teach them or work with a consultee who's having some issues. These give you just some suggested strategies. I'm not going to go into more of these because we're going to probably talk about them later. The only issue is they do help with some of these barriers that were just discussed. And then problem identification. All of these things we've just talked about, from defining the problem all the way through. There is an assessment tool called the PII, which you're going to be using later for your case, for this class. And it is in the course library. I want you to go to the course library, find it, look it over, and then tell me on your worksheet how well you think these things over here are measured based off of what the PII makes available to you. All right, so we're going to now do a case study approach and talk about that as well. But I am going to pause the video here because it is starting to get lengthy, and I want for it to be split into two sections.